Welcome back into the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. I am your host, Garrett Price, and I have my good friend Dave Kluge here with me. Dave, how's it going, buddy?
Going great, man. Thanks for having me. It's been too long. We always do this in the off season, and then the season comes around, and we're like too busy to guest on anybody else's shows. And then before we know it, a year goes by. But happy to be back here, man. Talking about some running backs today. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely love talking running backs. As a guy that in high school played running back and more of a running back, fullback, high red, but we'll call it a running back. I love scouting the position for the college prospects coming out into the NFL. So running backs are so fun to talk about. But even before we started recording here, you and I were touching on running backs a little bit and just the different philosophies and how they overlap and stuff. So Dave, if you don't mind kind of sharing a little bit before we get into our top 24 guys, how do you feel overall in Dynasty? This is a redraft. In Dynasty, how do you feel about the running back position?
It's typically something that I'm fading towards the top of my drafts. And I understand, if you're able to get one of these young studs for cheap somehow, it's great to have a guy like that. But the reality is you typically aren't getting those guys for cheap. And to get a guy like Bijan Robinson, you're passing up on a top 5 wide receiver potentially. And I just don't like doing that because as good as Bijan is and as good as we expect him to be, running backs are such a volatile position. And we saw this like 3 years ago where like two guys that were inside the top 5, Javonte Williams and Cam Akers, just had the floor drop from underneath them. And now they're essentially worthless, after one down season and one injury. And you don't really see that happen with other positions. So early in drafts and especially in startups, I'm looking to invest in premium positions that I know are going to have insulated value for years to come. So early in drafts, I'm almost exclusively looking at quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. And I'm okay just kind of patching together my running back room. I kind of jokingly said before we started recording, but I've said it on my show a lot too. I won a lot of leagues last year with Ty Chandler and Zamir White in my RB1 and RB2 spot. And those aren't guys you can like project week 1 workloads on, but these guys pop up every single year. So I like kind of looking at the vets, looking at the cheap year 2 and year 3 guys that have a path to relevance. And that's kind of what I like to do is take a quantity over quality approach at that position.
Yeah, for a long time we were pretty much in lockstep on that, and those that pay attention to the Dynasty Nerds page know that we recently did the likelihood of repeating as a running back one, and so on, and that really changed my. I don't want to say it changed my mind because there are plenty of times still in startups where I'll fade running back into obscurity, and I'm not taking my first one till round 9, something like that. The true zero RB approach, but if I find myself in a spot where I can get a guy that is elite and not just elite in last year's production, but also has the draft capital to back it up, also has like all of the things line up perfectly, I'm more willing to take one of those kind of guys than I ever was before, because the guys that we see repeat year after year after year as running back ones, it's almost never and as much as I like the guy and I was high on him, it's almost never the Kyren Williams. It's never the guys that are low draft capital, because what happens? Either injuries happen, and when they do, if they don't have that draft capital, they're not as willing to hoist and thrust them to the front again. They'll hold them back a little bit more. So for me, I am a little more willing to take the Bijans, a little more willing to take the Achans, the Gibbs, the guys like that at the top, if I see a path to realistic 2, 3, 4 years of running back one production, because of the gap that you have those guys and then everybody else, because so many of the Kyren Williams, the Rashad Whites, the guys like that just sneak in, or they have one good year. So often we don't necessarily see that repeat. But if I can't get one of those guys, I don't live in the Kenneth Walker, Josh Jacobs type of range. Like, if I'm not getting one of those elite guys, then I'm with you. I'm just fading it until I get one of the later round guys. But Dave, let's get into our top 24. And would you say, how much, when you do your dynasty rankings, how much do you factor in youth versus production now?
That's a good question. And I am going to typically favor youth, especially at the running back position, because we know the best years come from like age 23 to 25. And then they start the slow, steady trend downward. And of course, you've got your outliers, your Derrick Henrys and your Saquon Barkleys and your Christian McCaffreys that are going to perform well into their 20s. But that's not typically something that you want to bet on. So, doing a flat list of dynasty rankings, especially for running backs, I feel is really, really difficult. And I struggle all the time. And I don't know if this is something you talk a lot about here, Garrett. But I kind of put guys in buckets and then say
Mhm.
whether you are contending or rebuilding, how much you should be targeting these certain buckets. So, like, there's a few guys that just work in any build, like whether you're rebuilding or contending. Bijan Robinson, Brees Hall, Jameer Gibbs, you can fit those guys on just about any single roster and they'll work
Yep.
because they could still get better from here. They could still grow in value and they're going to be productive. But a guy like Christian McCaffrey, for instance, you could put him as your RB1 in dynasty rankings or your RB4 in dynasty rankings. And I don't think either is really wrong because if you're contending, Christian McCaffrey should be your RB1 because he's got a chance to finish there this year. And I get it. But if you're in a position where you're not expecting to win this year, like if you're not top 3 in team value, a guy like Christian McCaffrey should have no business even being on your radar. So it's really tough for me to just say this is how I rank running backs in dynasty. So what I do every offseason is this kind of exercise where I put players in different buckets where they have similar archetypes, similar ages, similar production profiles, and then talk about it from there. So I'll lump guys like Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, and Kenneth Walker together, guys who are still on the right side of the age curve. Kind of your discount options from that elite tier. And then a little bit further down, I'll lump guys like Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, and Tony Pollard together, guys who are veterans on new teams that have had productive profiles in the past, but we've got the uncertainty with a new team and how that's going to affect them. And that's opened up a little bit of a buy window. So I don't do good with listing running backs in sort of a flat ranking. I like putting them in these buckets because then I can kind of rank inside that bucket of how I prefer these guys.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And you know, I have to, when we're doing just straight rankings,
Hmm.
I always look at it for me from a startup perspective because otherwise you're right. Like am I a win now? Am I a rebuild? That's going to drastically change how I view Derrick Henry. That's going to drastically change how I view a young upside running back like a Jonathan Brooks. Like those two guys are going to almost flip in value depending on what boat I'm in. So I like to look at it from a rankings perspective as a startup because that's the easiest way for me to be able to do it. But it can be pretty tricky.
And I have to do that as well. It's we do have to give the consumers what they want, right? So like you can go to footballguys.com/rankings and see my flat dynasty rankings there. I do it, but that's what I like about dynasty is there's so much kind of game theory and roster construction that goes into it. Like in redraft, I don't want to simplify this too much, but like you could turn on auto draft from ADP, and you're going to have a team that you can field week one. In Dynasty, there's so much that goes into it. Like who you draft in the first 3 to 4
Yep.
rounds is going to kind of give you your team's identity and then reshape who your targets are in those middle to late rounds. So we do flat rankings here, of course, we have to, but I think there's
Have to.
so
Yep.
much more nuance that goes into how you should prefer guys based on who your first few picks are.
Love it. Love it. Absolutely. So, speaking of your first few picks, Dave, could you give me your top 5 dynasty running backs right now?
Yeah, for me, it's pretty simple. And I think the top 5 is going to be the same for a lot of people. I already mentioned Brees Hall, Bijan Robinson, Jameer Gibbs. After that, it's Christian McCaffrey. And then after that, for me, it's Jonathan Taylor. And Jonathan Taylor is kind of in a mini tier by himself because he's a little bit older than Brees, Robinson, and Gibbs. I've got him bucketed with Travis Etienne and Kenneth Walker, but he kind of is a tier above those guys. So that's my
Yeah.
top 5, pretty simply. I mean, I don't have to talk about it too much. We know what Brees Hall is. RB2 last year, pass catching machine. Bijan Robinson, he's got the elite prospect. Prospect, we know who he is, and we didn't see it all come together last year. But I think an improved situation now with Kirk Cousins and Zach Robinson can really elevate his ceiling. Jahmyr Gibbs is one of the tricky ones, and I don't know if you agree with me having him at RB3, because right now we see him. He's splitting touches with David Montgomery, and that's probably not going to change this year and might not even change in 2025, but he's so efficient with the touches that he does get that I'm confident ranking him there, because I think we're looking, with the draft capital, with the offensive line, with the success that we've seen from the Lions over the last couple of years, there's no reason not to expect RB1 production for the next 3 to 4 years. And then, of course, Christian McCaffrey and, like I mentioned, Jonathan Taylor to round out my top 5.
Yeah, our top 5s are almost identical. The only difference is I have Bijan ahead of Brees. But other than that, it's identical. I have Bijan, Brees, Gibbs at 3, Christian McCaffrey at 4, and Jonathan Taylor at 5. And for me, yeah, there's almost 2 tiers in this, because I don't view Gibbs, Brees, Bijan, like you could almost put them in a bucket, mix them up, and toss them out in any order, and I probably wouldn't be too upset. Gibbs would be the hardest one for me to draft first, but I don't see him significantly behind the other two. But I think they're all good prospects. They're all very young prospects still, so I feel good about all 3 of those guys. Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey. I struggle with what order to rank those guys because McCaffrey, obviously, the production is there, but you get an extra 2 years with Jonathan Taylor, 3 years. It's tough to rank those 2 for me, but I think the top 5 for most people, they're going to have that top 5 in some order. Maybe Taylor drops out, but for the most part, I think that's going to be the top 5 for almost everyone. This is where it gets real tricky from 5 to 10. This is where we can see a lot of variance and a lot of change based on this, because honestly, I feel good about through probably 8. I feel pretty confident in my order. After 8, I feel like you could rank number 9 through like number, I don't know. And that's why I'm not even, I don't usually get guys in this range. You could go through like 21, and I don't think there's a huge difference between a lot of those players. So that's where it gets really, really difficult. So let's just do 5 through 10 now, though. 6 through 10. Who do you have 6 through 10?
So I wonder if ours is going to be the same, because I think my RB8 is a little spicy, and a lot of people are going to push back on this one a little bit. But for 6 and 7, I've got Travis Etienne and Ken Walker. Is that who you've got at 6 and 7 as well?
I don't have those 2 guys at 6, 7. So this will be interesting. I'm excited.
So I got Travis Etienne and Ken Walker at 6, 7. At 8 and 9, I have Jonathan Brooks and Saquon Barkley. And I know that Jonathan Brooks ranking is going to raise some eyebrows, but we could talk about that in a little bit. 10 is tough for me because, like you said, it gets kind of flat here. And 10, 11, 12, and 13 are extremely flat for me. And I don't have really much of a stance to say one of these guys is assuredly better than the other. James Cook falls in at number 10 for me. But like I said, you can go all the way down to RB13 for me in my rankings. And that 10, 11, 12, 13 are so tight in value that like James Cook is kind of the de facto RB10 for me. But do you want me to go down with 11, 12, and 13? So it's James Cook, Rashad White, Kyron Williams, and Isaiah Pacheco. I have all of those guys lumped together in a very, very flat tier.
Okay. No, I like it. So for me, I have, and so I'm curious to see where you end up putting this guy, because this is the one name I haven't heard yet, and I feel confident with him at 6. Devon Achane.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Devon Achane. We saw what he did from an efficiency standpoint last year. I mean, elite, like truly elite numbers. We do have potential injury risk with him being a little bit of an undersized running back, but I know that there's some concern with Jalen Wright coming in and maybe taking some touches at some point. For me personally, that's just the new Raheem Mostert. Like for me, that doesn't really move the needle much. Achane's not a guy you want to give 20, 25 touches a game. He's more similar to Gibbs in the fact that give him 12, 15, maybe on a big week, 18 touches. And I feel great about that because I know at any point in time, he can rip off a 50-yard run for a touchdown and make my week in one play. So for me, I tend to be higher on Achane than the rest of the community. But I am surprised to not hear him inside your top 13. That is a big surprise for me.
and he's in my next tier. And, a little like peek
Okay.
behind the curtain, when we upload our rankings into footballguys.com, we get flagged for outliers, and we get this little red exclamation mark next to the guy's name
Sure.
if we are straying too far from consensus. And inside my top 24, the two guys that have this red exclamation mark next to them are Jonathan Brooks and Devon Achane. I'm too high on Jonathan Brooks,
Okay.
and I'm too low on Devon Achane. The concerns I have with Achane, like I understand everything you're saying, and I know a lot of people feel that way. Alfredo Brown's my co-host over at Football Guys, and we have had many an argument about Devon Achane this offseason. He's also a Dolphins fan, so he really loves him some Devon Achane.
Sure.
And I get it. I just, the upside was there last year. I get concerned about the injuries more than anything else. This is an undersized guy who dealt with injuries in college, got injured in the preseason, got injured multiple times in his first season. So I get what you're saying, that anytime he touches the ball, he can rip off a 50-yard touchdown, and he could do that 2 or 3 times in a single game. I worry about the longevity. I worry about his ability to stay healthy for a long time. I think them drafting Jalen Wright and extending Raheem Mostert kind of shows their cards a little bit about some of the concerns that they might have with this backfield as well. So I like Achane a lot, but given where his market price is right now, I've been trying to sell my Devon Achane shares this offseason. And I actually just recently I was able to flip Devon Achane for Jonathan Brooks in a second. And in my opinion, I prefer Jonathan Brooks in the second by quite a bit. I like Achane as a player. The talent is obviously there, and I could be totally wrong. Like, he could be the next Chris Johnson, where he's just going crazy on a limited touch count. We saw that with Jamal Williams as well. Like, he was never a 25 touch per game guy. He was just so efficient with the touches that he got that he was giving us high end RB1 production. That could be the case with Devon Achane. I just get scared off by the size and the injury history.
Sure. No, it makes perfect sense. Now, the other names overall inside the top 10, there's a decent amount of overlap. So at running back 7, I have Saquon Barkley. At running back 8, I have Travis Etienne. At running back 9, I have Josh Jacobs. And then at 10, I have Jonathan Brooks. So I got Jonathan Brooks inside my top 10 as well. I know that is a little spicy for some people to have a rookie running back that high. I believe in the player. I like what they did in that offense this past season, where they added a bunch of offensive linemen, a bunch of weapons in the draft. I think it's going to be a much better offense than we had from the Carolina Panthers last year. And I just think he's just significantly better than all the other backs on that roster. So I think he's going to get a lot of touches once he's fully healthy. It might be a little bit of a slow start coming off that ACL injury, but long-term, I have no issues with him. So overall, I think we have a lot of guys inside our top 10 that are same, but obviously Devon Achane is the biggest outlier. So I think you gave most of them, but go ahead and give me your 11 through 15.
Yeah, so Rachaad White, Kyren Williams, and Isaiah Pacheco kind of get lumped in that same tier with James Cook. And like, even right now, looking at that tier, I don't feel confident in how I have them ranked. Like, I could easily move Isaiah Pacheco ahead of James Cook, or Rachaad White ahead of James Cook, or Kyren Williams. Like, that's a very flat tier for me. But once I get outside of there, then it's Devon Achane and Trey Benson are my 14 and 15. And so one of the first questions you asked on the show was like, do you prioritize youth in your rankings? And I think as we're going through my rankings here, you're kind of getting that answer. I do prioritize youth quite a bit. And, there's obviously some really productive guys once you get a little bit lower down this list. But, given the volatile nature of the running back, I know you're a little bit higher on Josh Jacobs. You said you had him inside the top 10. And I think that's, totally well warranted. A first round pick who's been very productive. It's just we see it so often where these guys, like I said, could just have the value fall out from underneath them. Now, I don't think that's going to happen with Josh Jacobs, but it could so easily. It could happen with Christian McCaffrey. Like, once you get to this age, one season-ending injury, value's just completely tail spinning from there, and it's never really going to regain itself. So when I'm ranking these running backs, something I prioritize, it's not just the youth factor, but it's the fact that I want to invest in guys that I think have an opportunity to grow their value, not guys who are going to be depreciating assets potentially.
Absolutely, and I'm with you. And I actually was even more bullish on Benson. So for me, I have Kyren Williams at 11. Then I have Trey Benson at 12.
Love it.
I loved his tape. Loved his tape. As far as a prospect, I actually had him above Jonathan Brooks as a prospect, just as a raw player. Now, obviously, the situation, the early opportunity is a little bit better for Jonathan Brooks. So that's what ended up putting him 2 spots higher for me. But I love everything I've seen out of Trey Benson. You put him in that Arizona Cardinals offense, and they've shown the propensity to be willing to just give one guy the load. And that's huge for fantasy football because so many backfields are timeshares now. And it looks like Trey Benson, if he can keep up with the receiving work, it's going to be his backfield. So it would not surprise me if this time next year we're talking about, okay, do we go with Trey Benson? Do we go with Jonathan Taylor? Like, that's the type of range I could see him being in if he develops like I think he will towards the end of this season. So,
And the thing, James Conner is like a lock to miss 4 to 5 games every single season.
Every year.
Like we just know that's what happens with James Conner. So I could see that totally happening this year where like you look at the end of season finish for Trey Benson and it might not be great, but he's going to get a handful of starts this year on what I expect to be a much improved Arizona Cardinals offense. And I think that we're going to see exactly what you're saying. We're going to see these starts. He's going to be productive in these starts going into the offseason. That's why I like drafting Trey Benson right now, because he's a guy that I could see just shooting up dynasty rankings after this season.
Yep.
Not even after this season, like after his first start potentially, whenever that may come.
Absolutely, because cost-wise, Jonathan Brooks is going to cost you a lot more than Trey Benson, and it would not be surprising at all to me if Trey Benson ends up being the more valuable asset of the two. So at 13, I was a little bit lower on this guy. I have Kenneth Walker at 13. Part of the reason I have him decently low is because with this new offense, you're going from a team that ran the ball more than almost any other team in football year after year after year to now an offensive coordinator that threw the ball a ton. Mm-hmm. And so, there's probably not going to be more rushing opportunities for Kenneth Walker. If anything, there's going to be less. Then you never know how new coaching staffs view running backs. Could it be something where Zach Charbonnet is much more involved than we expect him to be? So, so for me, what's that?
Please let Zach Charbonnet be more involved, because my bags are packed, man. I've got Zach Charbonnet on almost every team.
There you go. You're ready to go, man. You're ready to go. So I have him at 13. At 14, this you see a little bit of difference in ours here. I have Ramondre Stevenson at 14. I really like Ramondre Stevenson as a player, but I had him in the 21, 22, 23 range a little bit ago. That new contract changed everything for me. Money talks, baby. Money talks.
Yeah.
So that gave me so much more confidence in a guy like Ramondre Stevenson. And then, like I said, like this whole range, I could move in and out, but I have Najee Harris at 15. And so I know that there's a few names that you had in the 10, 11, 12, 13 range that I haven't even gotten to yet. So we'll discuss them in a second. All right, give me your 16 through 20.
All right, so 16 is Josh Jacobs for me. And like I said, I think Josh Jacobs is a great player. He's got the first-round draft capital. He's got a contract now with a good team. It's just the age. Once they start getting up there in age a little bit, I get a little bit concerned. Also, Marshawn Lloyd is there, and I expect him to be somewhat involved in this offense. We've always seen Green Bay kind of look at a two-man backfield here. So I'm probably a little bit too low on Josh Jacobs, but he's just not a guy that I've been looking at as like a primary target. At 17, I got Blake Corum. So that's the third rookie that is inside my top 20 there. I don't know if that's shocking to you or not. I'm a big fan of Blake Corum.
That's a surprise.
Yeah, I'm high on Blake Corum, but I'm also a little bit lower on Kyron Williams. So I'll let you kind of fill in the blanks there on how I feel about this backfield in Los Angeles. After Blake Corum, I've got DeAndre Swift, Alvin Kamara, and then Tajay Spears rounding out my top 20.
Okay. So for me, I have Javonte Williams at 16. Now, this is going to be one where I know that there's going to be plenty of people that have him outside the top 20. And I can't blame anyone for doing so. But what we typically see is guys coming off ACL injuries. First year is usually kind of meh. And then it's in year 2 after the injury that we see them return to pretty similar form as to what they had before the injury. Before the injury, we were talking about, Javonte as a top 10, top 5 type of guy. Will we still get that? I don't know. But he's a player where I loved his ability and his tape and stuff in his first couple seasons enough where I'm willing to take him a little bit higher than other people might, but we'll have to see. 17, DeAndre Swift. And then this is where I get into the range where some of the guys that you were talking about. I have James Cook at 18, Isaiah Pacheco at 19, and Tyjae Spears at 20. James Cook, Isaiah
at least
Pacheco.
we agree on Tyjae Spears at 20.
I love it.
Right there.
I love Tyjae Spears. I'm a huge fan of his game. We recently did a thing where looking at guys, players that get over 30 receptions in their first, at least in one of their first 2 seasons, their odds of being a successful running back are astronomically higher than guys that don't. In fact, we've only had 2 guys that have had averaged more than 12 career points per game and at least one season over 16 points a game. And that was Derrick Henry and Aaron Jones. Those are the only 2 guys that didn't have 30 catches in their first 2 seasons. So you can almost write off any running back if they don't have 30 catches in their first 2 seasons. You can basically write them off at that point. But he hit the threshold. Feel pretty good about him. But as far as James Cook goes, he had a good season last year, but I feel like he's being a little artificially propped up. Yes, he finished as an RB1, and if you just leave it at that, you feel pretty good about it. But the problem is, if you look at the points per game, they weren't that great. He was just one of the few running backs that played in every single game. Then you factor in Ray Davis. I don't think Ray Davis is going to be overly involved, but I think he could take enough of the between the tackle stuff to be annoying. And so I'm not sure if we're going to see quite as good of a season from James Cook. I would expect him to fall out of that running back one conversation. And then Isaiah Pacheco at 19.
Scenario for James Cook.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good.
The worst case scenario for James Cook, though, we just talked about him being one of my fades in 2024 redraft leagues because you talk about Ray Davis, and I think he could take some of the early down work, but Ray Davis is also an underrated pass catcher, and he's also going to be the guy that probably gets the majority of the goal line work. You know, they've been looking for that guy for years with Latavius Murray and Leonard Fournette and Damian Harris. Like, they keep trying to bring in this guy to take the load off of Josh Allen near the goal line. James Cook isn't a goal line back. You know, they were trying to use him on end arounds and option routes and things like that because they didn't have another guy. So I think that's the worst case scenario for James Cook, is that if he wants to score touchdowns, he might have to do it from outside of the red zone because Ray Davis could end up taking all of the red zone work. He could also cut into like 40 or 50% of the receiving work. And if that's the case, then we're looking at James Cook as kind of this low value touch guy who's getting carries between the 20s and not much outside of that. So I think there is a very dangerous floor with James Cook. It's just that round 2 draft capital that has me moving him a little bit up because I think that that'll kind of keep his value insulated for a couple more years.
Yeah, and that's why I talked about saying after 8, which is Travis Etienne, and then 9 is Josh Jacobs. I said I don't see a huge difference between them and the guys in the early 20s. And so that's why for me, like, I'm not prioritizing those mid-range running backs at all because I think they're all very, very similar. For Isaiah Pacheco, it's just lack of true 3-down work. He's not going to catch a lot of passes in that offense. So I think he's going to be one of those guys that's always a steady running back 2, but it's going to be hard for him to get into that running back 1 range. So my last 4 here, I finally have Rachaad White. Rachaad White at 21 for me. I have him significantly lower than almost everyone is going to rank him. The thing for me is the efficiency level was gross last year. He was actually tied for second in total attempts, running back attempts, and that was with Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey had like 500 some more yards than him on the ground. The only other person to do more was Derrick Henry, and he had about 150 to 200 more yards than Rachaad White. So very, very inefficient on the ground. And you look at a guy like Bucky Irving coming in. Bucky Irving, he was one of 2 players to catch over 50 passes from the running back position last season. So where's the production going to come from Rachaad White? Yes, I still think he's the lead back and the main back, but I think Bucky Irving is going to be very, very annoying, and it's going to cannibalize a little bit of the work from Rachaad White. Zamir White at 22, Alvin Kamara at 23.
Love that one.
Yeah, it's a little spicy.
Like
but I like Zamir. And he's young. You know, even if it's just a 2-year thing, all of these other guys after him are also only giving you a couple years. So I have Alvin Kamara and Joe Mixon as my last 2 guys. Dave, give me your last 4.
Yeah, this is where I thrive, and like I could just keep going down the list here. This is where I really like, I said I kind of take a volume over or a quantity over quality approach at the running back position, and these are the guys that are
Yeah.
just so cheap that I like to try to get one or two of the young guys if I can, if they fall in value a little bit. But really, these guys here are where I'm trying to beef up my depth as much as possible. So 21, I got Tony Pollard. 22, I got Ramondre Stevenson. 23 is Derrick Henry, and 24 is Zamir White. But then once you get a little further down the list, I'm not going to go all the way down, but this is where I
Sure.
have a lot of productive veterans. So Joe Mixon, David Montgomery, Brian Robinson, guys that I think you can get for relatively cheap. And
Yep.
maybe they're nothing. Maybe you're not getting anything out of Derrick Henry for the next couple of years. Maybe Joe Mixon, his inefficiencies show up more on a new team or something like that. But considering you can get these guys for like late seconds and early thirds and could get potential RB1 value, even if it's just for 1 or 2 seasons, these are the guys that I try to target as much as I can just because they're cheap. And that's really what it comes down to. Like if I had to pay a first round pick for Derrick Henry, I'd be totally out. But if I can get him for a late second, I'll gladly plug him in as my RB2.
Absolutely. Yep. Totally agree with you. And I'm in the same boat. I have the next three guys, our next four guys are Pollard, Montgomery, Henry, and Chubb. A bunch of old guys who knows exactly what we're gonna get. So exact same boat as you. So Dave, thank you so much for talking running backs with me today. Truly enjoyed talking about these guys with you and the differences in our approach and where we rank guys. Remind the good folks real quick where they can find you, what you're working on, all that good stuff as we get closer to the season.
Yeah, real simply, you can find all my content over at footballguys.com. I've got the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show that I do with Alfredo Brown. We're doing 3 episodes a week right now. Within the next couple of weeks, we're ramping up to 5 episodes a week. So you can find that on YouTube, podcasts, wherever you want to listen to that. And then, of course, you can find me over on Twitter at Dave Kluge. Share all of my content there. So audio shows, YouTube shows, articles that I write, all that good stuff at Dave Kluge on Twitter.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you're watching this, within the next few days, we are going to be dropping our top 100 players for fantasy football of the 2000s. So a big 10-part series should be super cool. So make sure you tune into that as well. And we will be back with more content very soon.